Hi, my name is Sean McIntosh, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar on how to license contractors and other non-employees. Lines will be muted during the webcast, and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat console, and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and is available for encore viewing at method180.com. Our speaker today is Mike Austin. Mike leads the service delivery team at Method 180 and has successfully negotiated over $1 billion in Microsoft contracts over his career. He spent almost a decade working at Microsoft in licensing-related roles and has extensive experience with best practices regarding software licensing. I'll turn things over to Mike to get the presentation started.
On our webinars before, this will be a little bit of a replay, but I won't take long just to give you a little bit of, for those that are new today, a little bit of an overview of the firm. So we provide two kind of primary things to our clients around consulting services to help organizations structure and negotiate smarter contracts with Microsoft. And then for those of you that happen to be going through an audit or a SAM process with Microsoft, or just want to do a self-assessment and understand where you are from a compliance perspective, we provide those services as well. And so that's all I'm going to do for the kind of commercial portion of today, but I'm going to dive right into it. We're going to talk about how to license contractors. I think this is an important topic because it's one of these things that is sort of ever changing on the Microsoft front, and it kind of changes in regards to two sorts of things. One is it's changed because of changes that Microsoft has made to contract language. But the second thing is it's changing because of ways that people are, providing technology or the technology that they're accessing, such as VDA or Office 365. And I also think that organizations as a whole are sort of stepping back and looking at their cost associated with software and trying to figure out, where are there areas for opportunity to decrease costs or not spend on, things that they don't need to. So it is something that we hear quite a bit from our clients. How do we license contractors? And so today what I wanted to do is probably a little bit different for some of you that have been on some of the past webinars that I've done. I actually want to dive in a little bit today and kind of show you how we actually dissect and figure out, when and where and how contractors need to be licensed. But I think I just wanted to start with, what we hear in the market around, contractors, contingent staff and things like that. But, one of the things that people ask us quite often is, if I'm licensing contractors, particularly take an example of, say, offshore developers, am I paying for licenses that the contractor may already own? And the answer to this question is most likely. It's unfortunate, but there's a lot of scenarios where organizations are paying for licenses that their contractors already own, and they may not have to pay for those. There are scenarios where in the Microsoft rules, both organizations need to purchase licenses, but it is something that we get asked quite a bit. Are we double paying? And the answer is most likely. You most likely are, and we're going to go through that in a little bit here. A lot of companies want to know, do they need to license their contractors? Is this something that I need to include in my, counts for Windows and Office and my, my CoreCals or my Office 365 licenses within my EA? And unfortunately, like many things when it comes to Microsoft, there's no, straightforward answer. The answer to this is maybe. You may have to license them. There may be no options, and we're going to go through how to start to determine that. And then the other thing that people are always asking is, what sort of indicators should I be looking for within the organization to figure out whether I need to be licensing our contractors? And so here, some of the key things. Are you providing them with hardware? We're going to talk about why. That's an important one. But if you are providing them with hardware, then it's probably very likely that you have to license them. Similarly to maybe you aren't providing them hardware, but you're giving them access through a VDI infrastructure. If you're giving them access to VDI, then there are scenarios where you're going to have to provide them with licenses, even if they own those. Do you provide them with an email address? There are cases where you have to provide licenses to them if you're giving them email or even say access to SharePoint. But the big thing is, what does your contract say? And this is This is what I really want to focus in on today is what does your contract say? Because this is how you actually start to determine whether you need to license contractors or not. So, you know, a lot of the times people will be, okay, Mike, how do we figure out whether we need to license them? And the key thing, like I said, is it's in your contract. But it's also in this document that a lot of people may have heard of before. It's now called the Microsoft Product Terms. They made that change back in, I think, the summer of 2015 to the thing Product Terms. But prior to that, it used to be called the Product Use Rights and a document called the Product List, and they kind of combined them into the Product Terms. So you actually have to go and look in, you know, I'm just going to use product terms. You got to go and look in those product terms. And unfortunately, this is one of these scenarios where, depending on what you're doing, what program you're on, you may have a different answer. So if I have an enterprise agreement, the answer is definitely going to be different than if I'm licensing through something like the MPSA program or Select. And so you could have scenarios in your environment where, depending on if you have an enterprise agreement, let's say for Office and Core Cals, but you don't have the Windows Desktop OS in, you may have to license contractors for Office and Core Cals, but not license them for the Windows OS. And so, you know, it really depends on your program. I'm going to focus a lot on this call on the EAs, obviously, because the vast majority of, you know, our clients and enterprise customers, like those of you on this call, have an enterprise agreement. But the key message that I want to try and get across this afternoon is that what we're actually trying to do is look for ways to exempt from having to license contractors. And that is the key concept. And as I go through this, I think it'll start to become a little bit clearer. But that's what we're really trying to do, is we want to look at all this language and what we're specifically doing with contractors to figure out if we can exempt them, okay? So how does this start? So I'm going to assume you have an enterprise agreement. And basically, and I apologize, I know some of this slide's probably a little blurry, but you know, I've taken some images directly from an enterprise agreement so that we can actually see the language and talk about it, okay? And so where this starts is in the definition of qualified user. So Microsoft, you know, says that a qualified user is an employee, a consultant, or contingent staff. Okay, so right there's our first clue that Microsoft wants us to license consultants. Now, it is important to look at the language that's in your contract, because depending on the version of the enterprise agreement, and this could be either in the master under the definitions section of the master agreement of the EA, or in an enrollment, depending on the definitions in an enrollment, depending on how old your contract is, this language has changed. And so this is one of those things that I was alluding to in the opening, is it now says consultant. In older contracts, it says on-site consultants. So Microsoft removed that word on-site, okay? And so, you know, here's our first indication, like I was saying, that they want us to license this word consultant in what they define as a qualified user. And so then they go on and say that a qualified user, including our consultants, is a user of a qualified device. So we're going to have to go and look and see what a qualified device is, and or accesses any server software requiring an enterprise product client access license or an enterprise online service. Okay, so what that means is if they have a qualified device, or they require access to a server that is included in the Core Cal or the eCal. So unfortunately, Windows is included in there. So even if we're not giving them Exchange or SharePoint, Microsoft is basically saying that if we're giving them access to Active Directory, so to speak, then they need to be a licensed, or they need to be licensed, okay? And so then it does says it's not, or then they do go on and say it's not somebody who accesses server software or an online service solely under a license identified in the qualified user exemption in the product terms. So we're going to have to go and look at what that is, and we're going to do that here in a little bit. But the key thing here is a couple of things. One is that the language says consultant. The second thing is it says that they have to be a qualified device user. But the thing, they have the word accesses here, but access is the key word. It's not use. Okay? And so this actually is one place that people get caught up. And if you've been on any of my calls before where we talk about audit, we talk about access versus use quite often. But I've had a lot of people who, you know, have contractors that are in Active Directory groups that have access to Exchange servers or SharePoint servers, even though they're not utilizing them, and then therefore its use. So again, because Windows servers is in that enterprise product client access license that they call up out there, they're going to have access to Windows servers, which kind of puts them in play here. The other thing when it talks about enterprise online services is just one of the keys to note is that is E-plans. Okay, there is language that exempts K-plans. So if you're providing them access to an Office 365 E-plan, and that includes the new ones like your SCE, the secure cloud, E3 or E5, all of those kind of fall into that category. Okay, so first, I guess the key thing is our contract, if we're in an EA, is saying that we have to license consultants. So remember what I said, the key is that we're looking for ways to exempt people so that we don't have to license them, okay? So the next thing is that if they were using a qualified device. So what is a qualified device? This is a wordy one. I'm not going to read it word for word, but I'm going to go through a couple of the key concepts here. One of the key things is it says that a qualified device is any machine that is capable. Again, that word capable is key, that can run Office or Windows locally or virtually. So if they have a machine that can run Windows or Office, then it is considered a qualified device. Now, they do go along and say you can exempt them in one of two areas. And so in here it says that if it is designated, I guess there's three areas. If it's designated as a server and not used as a personal computer, you can exempt it. So servers don't count, which is good. But the second thing it says is an industry device or not a managed device. So, that's what we need to go and look at next. So, and this here, when we're talking about qualified devices, we're going to really we're really focusing on Office and Windows here. But again, it says a qualified user is anybody that uses a qualified device. So if they have a qualified device, then, they are a qualified user, and therefore anything that's user-based licensing, CALs or Office 365, in theory, need to be licensed, okay? So Microsoft further goes along in this contract and identifies what an industry device is. Okay, again, I'm just going to make sure that I reiterate here. Just because this is a language that is in one of the current contracts, this does not mean that this is what your current language is. So you actually have to go and look for these definitions within your contract to see if it's the same one or if it's different and how those differences apply. But anybody that's kind of signed a newer contract within the last 4 or so years, 4 maybe 5 years, this is sort of going to be the language that's in there with maybe some tweaks. Okay. So basically, an industry device is something that maybe if they're running an industry device that we could exempt from having to license these contractors with. Okay, so what do they say is an industry device? It's a general purpose computer, such as a personal computer, that acts as a multifunctional server, we don't have those, or only employs an industry or task-specific software. Okay, so basically what they're saying here, they give us an example of a computer-aided design program or point of sale. So does that PC that this contractor is using only run a very specific software, and that's all that it runs? Okay, so I always say that it's very highly unlikely that we'll be able to exempt somebody under this industry device clause, but there are potentials, okay, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Because what it does say is, and the reason I say it's highly unlikely, is that it's most likely that these contractors have Office on there. And and if it's got Office, because we go back to the thing, if it's capable of running Office or is running Office, it's a qualified device. So they do have some stuff in here that says, if the device performs desktop functions, for example, email, word processing, spreadsheet, database, Office functions, in other words, the Office functions, then it may only be used for the purpose of supporting the industry program functionality. Okay, so what does that mean? That would mean that in the case of our point of sale scenario here, that the only reason that they could use Office on this industry device would be that it is supporting some output coming out of that point of sale program. So in other words, the end users on there could not open up Outlook and send email. If they do that, then it gets disqualified, okay? Or it must be technically integrated with the industry program or employ some other policies to, to ensure that it's only doing that functionality. So it's saying it could be there, but But if you put some technology in place to make sure they can't use Office, even though it's there, then you could exempt it. Okay. So, like I said, if you look at this, it's highly unlikely that contractors, based on what most people are using contractors for, are going to be able to be exempt from being licensable. But there are some scenarios where potentially contractors could be excluded under industry device. A great example of one is in business, like BPO, business process operations, where you have, I don't know, say somebody like Accenture that's just doing entries into SAP, and they just have functions for SAP on those desktops. You could exclude those desktops as industry devices, which would then exclude those contractors as being included as qualified employees in your contract. Okay, but that's like one scenario. Most of the time, if you've got offshore developers, you may be able to make an argument that they're just doing development, but it would be hard to prove that they're not using Office, to send email, for instance, out of Outlook. Okay, so this is how you start to exempt, to remove contractors from your contract, or to say we have to license them. You really got to go in and dig into all of these sorts of clauses. Now, one of the things that I do say is if you were able to exempt somebody for an industry device, for instance, one of the things that we highly recommend that you do is create a profile for contractors that excludes them from, say, needing Office or Windows or CALs, depending on which product we're able to exclude them from, so that you can then utilize that software, utilize that to use that in your contract to prove that you've excluded them from there. Okay. The other thing that I always say, and I'm going to touch on this again, is that one of the things that you want to do as well is if you are excluding them and not licensing them, you want to try and get into your contract with them, so the contract between your company and the contracting company, so to speak, language that says that they're responsible for software and hardware. Okay, that helps a lot, especially when you're trying to prove that you're not responsible for it. Okay, so again, we're going to dive into these things to figure out whether we can exempt. That's what we're looking to do. Okay, so one of the reasons that it said we could exempt it is if it's not a managed device. Or, sorry, we have to include it as a qualified device if it is a managed device. And so in the EA, it's got a definition of managed device that states that it's any device which an affiliate or enterprise indirectly or directly controls one or more operating system environments, and examples can be found in the product terms. So the definition they have of a managed device in the EA itself is rather vague. I'm not even quite sure how you directly or indirectly control an operating system environment, but let's go and see what that says. So here what I've done is I've gone into the product terms, and I've gone and pulled the definition of managed device. Now, you'll see that I got yellow highlighting in here. The product terms are a huge document. They're over, I think, 160 pages. So finding the relevant information in those product terms is difficult. So where I have yellow is because I searched for managed, because that was the only way I could really find where they'd hidden this definition of management for qualified devices within the product terms. Because if you were going to go look for it, I went to the index, which would be where you would think to look for managed devices, and there was nothing there. So I had to kind of search for it and find it. Okay. So basically, a managed device from Microsoft, and this is actually not just relevant for that definition of are they using a qualified device for contractors. This is also important when it comes to looking at BYOD, which we're not talking about on this call, but if any of you are doing BYOD, if one of your employees brings in their own PC and it's managed, then it becomes a qualified device under your enterprise agreement. You need to count those, but that's a topic for a different day. But really what happens is if you look up here, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail here, but there's basically 6 things that if any one of these 6 things is happening, then it's a managed device. One of the key things, it allows it to join to a domain. So that's why I said the Windows AD for that enterprise CAL is probably going to make them qualified employees under Microsoft's definition, because if you're letting them in, letting a contractor in to have access to a system of yours, irregardless, I guess is the right word to use, of if that's a Microsoft system or not, they're joining your domain, therefore they're utilizing one of those enterprise client access licenses and are qualified, what Microsoft then calls them as a qualified employee. Okay, so if they've got a device, regardless of whether it's yours or not, and you're letting it join to a domain, it could become a qualified device, and you have to license it. And so these are the things, like I said, that if you're doing these things, any one of these 6 things allows it or makes it a qualified device. So the next thing I want to do is go back. So we've kind of gone through that path. I want to go back and look at the last part of that qualified user, because maybe we have an opportunity here, because I said what we want to try and do is exempt us from having to license them. And there's some wording here that leads us to hopefully go down a good path that says, you know, unless they are solely under a license identified in the qualified user exemption in the product terms. Okay, cool. That sounds promising. Let's go and look and see what that is. So I'm going to go into the product terms again here and pull up the definition of qualified user exemption. So, exemption, applicable to users who access products solely under one of these licenses. These users are exempt, and you can kind of see that I'm dying off here. The reason is this language actually is not very helpful. It doesn't tell us anything. You know, I would have hoped that when I saw that maybe there was a list of ways that we could disqualify somebody from being a qualified user. There is no list. It's these 2 simple sentences that really don't tell us much. Okay, so what does this really mean? It means that we have to look at the products themselves. So we're going to have to go and look at Office, the CALs, or where you require CALs, the Windows OS. We have to go look at them themselves. The qualified user exemption itself is mostly relevant only when it comes to products that are licensed without CALs on the server side. So think about SQL Server core licenses as being a great example of that. So this is really what this is about. Although we would have hoped that would have been a list of, you know, how we could maybe exempt qualified users and contractors. This really wasn't much help. Okay, so there's a couple other things in the product terms that we need to talk about before we sort of start to pull this all together. There's this thing called an external connector license. And so that is a license that's dedicated or assigned to a server that allows access by external users. Okay, so basically what this is saying is if I have an external connector, that I don't have to buy client access licenses for my external users. So this could be helpful because it says external users, and our contractors are external users, particularly those ones that are not on site. I think in some cases you could probably even make arguments for on-site contractors, but you know, it says external users. These aren't our employees; they're external to us. So this should be promising. So next thing we want to do is go and see, is there a definition of external user within the product terms? And it means users that are not either customers or its affiliates employees or its affiliates on-site contractors. Awesome. So it's saying if it's not its on-site contractor, so if they're external contractors, then they're external users. So we can use external connectors, right? The answer is maybe. And the unfortunate thing about that answer being maybe is because we would have had to have been able to exempt them from that qualified user definition inside of our enterprise agreement right from the get-go that says if they're using a qualified device or we're giving them access to one of those enterprise products, Office, Windows, or the CALs. And so that's where it becomes maybe, okay? And that's the unfortunate thing because some of these things are free. The external connectors are actually included in certain server licenses like SharePoint and Exchange. And I just want to talk a little bit more about external connectors for a quick second here before I kind of keep going. You know, a great example of external connectors, and I'm Canadian, so I'm going to use a hockey example here. But, you know, where external connectors come in very helpful for organizations is if you take the NHL, the players within the NHL actually are not employees of the NHL. And this is true for whether it's the NFL or Major League Baseball as well, I would assume, but they're not employees of the NHL. They're actually on personal services contracts with the owners of the individual teams that they play for. So if we take Sidney Crosby playing for Pittsburgh, he's not an employee of the NHL. He, worked for the owner, I guess it's Mario Lemieux, of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And so if you take a look at that, if the NHL wants to give Sidney Crosby, Sidney.Crosby@NHL.com email address, he's not their employee, so he could be the way that they would license him is through this external connector, which is included in Exchange in some circumstances. If you're using standard features, if you're using Enterprise, it's a different story, but assuming they're just giving them Exchange standard, the NHL could give all of their players email without a cost. And so that's why this becomes so powerful once you start to really dive in and look at these things, because it's going to give you that opportunity to really look at where can we exempt and where can we pull out, kind of some of these costs. Okay, and that's why these external connectors become very powerful if we can get our contractors exempt from that qualified employee definition. Okay. So the next thing we have to do is go and start to look in the product terms to figure out if contractors are exempted anywhere else. And so when it comes to licensing within the product terms, there's universal license terms and then there's individual product terms. And the universal terms apply to things like desktop applications, to the desktop OS, to servers license, server cal, etc. And so what we want to do is then go and start to look and see, are there anything within the universal license terms that allow us to pull exemptions, okay? And so that's what I've done here is I've gone and just pulled up the universal license terms for the desktop applications, which Office falls under. And again, I'm not going to read through this, but basically it says that if it's a licensed device, that they can access it, but it doesn't talk about people that aren't your employees. So there's really not much help here because it has to be. It's just saying that the device itself needs to be licensed to use Office, right? And even in a remote scenario, so where you're doing VDI scenarios, the device that's accessing the server needs to be licensed for Office. So again, the universal terms aren't going to help us much here. So let's see if the desktop OS gives us an opportunity to exempt. And if you read through this, you're going to see that basically there's nothing here that talks about external use or any of that sort of stuff. So there's no opportunity here either on the desktop OS. So again, when I'm looking at these in a client environment, I'm going to go product by product in those Office, Windows OS, CALs, Office 365 to see where there's opportunity to exempt contractors. Okay, so if we look at the per core / CAL model, which is the new server, this is basically Windows Server, where Windows Server's core-based licenses now / CAL. Again, I'm not going to go and read through this, but this talks about what I can do with virtualization rights with servers. Tells me that I need to have CALs and things like that, but again, nothing to exempt people. The other thing here is just let's look at server cal, right? So this would be, say, SharePoint and Exchange. Again, nothing here. So in the universal terms, there's nothing that addresses contractors or external users. So we're kind of left to now go and look at individual products. I am just going to run up a quick poll because I know this topic can be very complex, and trying to kind of cover it in 40, 45 minutes to give people some time to ask some questions is tough. But if you want to just answer this, sorry, wrong one here. If you want to have a call to discuss this, I'm happy to jump on a call to talk about some of your unique situations. Obviously, we can't look at doing an engagement completely, but if you want to click yes, we'll see who you are, and we'll reach out and maybe we can answer a couple of questions that you may have that's particular to yours. Because I think what you see here is that these are sort of things that drive specifically to your actual scenarios. Okay. So the next thing that you would then do is go and look at these, the product terms themselves for the product. So I just pulled up an example of Office applications here. And what you'll see here is there is this thing that says qualified user exemption. So that's, you know, what we're looking for, but it's not applicable, right? There's nothing there again. So there's nothing very helpful for us there. And so if you go and actually look at Windows Desktop OS, I didn't want to pull them all up again, but or Office 365, you're going to see the same. Sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see my screen while the poll was up, Sean. Just let me know. So I'll take that back here. What I was saying is, if you go into the product terms and look at Office itself, you're going to look and see this section here where it says qualified user exemption, not applicable. So there's really nothing there to help us. And if you go and actually look at Windows Desktop OS or Office 365, you're going to see that same not applicable. So there's really nothing there that's going to help us. So the next thing we would want to do is go and look at a little further down under Office within the product terms is another thing that says external user access requirements. So again, this is not applicable. So what that's actually saying is there's no external connector available for Microsoft Office. So then you're going to have to go back to that determination of, is it a qualified device? Because if it is, then you're going to need to license them for Office. The next one I wanted to look at was one of the servers, just to show you what happens a little bit different is, so under Windows servers, you see this qualified user exemption, says external connectors. So there's a great example where we don't necessarily need to purchase Windows CALs for them because we can buy external connectors, and we may not need CALs. And so depending on how much an external connector is versus how many external users, it may be cheaper to buy external connectors than CALs, okay? But again, we got to go back to that qualified employee language. So if we were able to exempt them from qualified employee, then we could use external connectors, okay? I don't want to go through all the products, but I just wanted to show this as well because this is sort of one of these areas where sometimes people get caught if you really don't look. If you look here, qualified user exemption, not applicable. So for Exchange and SharePoint, that's what you're going to see is not applicable. Whereas with Windows, I'll just go back, it had the external connectors there. But if you go down further, you're going to see licensed with server. So this is one of those ones where I was saying before that the external connector is actually free with an Exchange or a SharePoint server, okay? So I know that's a lot, right, in such a short period of time in terms of diving in and taking a look at how do we determine if we have to license contractors? And so, you know, where does this leave us? The unfortunate thing is there is no silver bullet that says yes or no. And even in certain scenarios where if you go through and you look at your use scenarios, how they're accessing, because that's how you actually determine these things, right? You have to go and look and say, you know, if I've got an example where I have an offshore developer that we give a VDI instance to where we put just the Windows OS, but we give them access to our systems through this VDI instance, you know, if I look at that, are they a qualified user? Did we give them a qualified device? Potentially, because they're authenticating to the domain, which makes it a managed device. Did we give them access to an enterprise CAL component? Yes, because they're authenticating to a domain, which would mean that they require Windows. So if you look at that from a technical perspective, you know, Microsoft would make an argument that that offshore contractor coming in through VDI is a qualified employee because you can't exempt them from qualified device and they're using that CAL. So you really have to kind of dissect and peel back what they're doing and figure out how do I address my unique situation of my contractors and what they're doing. Now there are certain scenarios where if the organization itself has contractors, you may have some contractors that need to be licensed and others that do not, okay? Areas that are going to be direct, you know, you're probably not going to be able to get out of licensing them, or if you're doing VDI, you're definitely going to be in for Windows and Office. You know, you can sometimes make an argument with Microsoft around some of the CALs there, but Windows, if Office is in that VDI, you're probably going to be stuck there. If you're giving them Office 365 because the Office 365 tenant has no mechanism to my knowledge, and we've been trying to play with it because we use Office 365 here to see if we can put non-third parties on and not pay for, an Office 365 license. We haven't figured it out yet. So I think if you're giving them Office 365, you're probably going to be stuck licensing them. And if you provide them hardware, you're definitely probably going to be stuck licensing them. Now, when I say that you're stuck licensing them, that does not mean that I have to go out and give my contractors Office Windows and an eCal or an Office 365 E3 or whatever it is. That's what Microsoft wants. That's what this language is leading to. But this is an area where you can negotiate with Microsoft, and it is an area where, in order to negotiate and be successful negotiating with them, you have to go back and look at your scenarios and kind of map those out to figure out what is it that I'm doing, how am I doing that, so that I can have a good argument with Microsoft on why I shouldn't do that, right? So, for instance, we've got organizations that we've worked with where they're providing VDIs that do not have Office. It's just for offshore developers. They do not give them email. They do not give them access to SharePoint. And so we were able to have a discussion with Microsoft, even though they had a full platform EA with Office, OS, and CALs, that they created a profile for contractors that was just actually a VDA license for them to access that VDI environment, so to speak. But that's the sort of thing. There's no standard written rule here. These are the sorts of things that you want to look at negotiating with Microsoft, and we really suggest trying to lock down some language with them if and when possible to do that. Now, sometimes doing this when you're doing your contract renewal is not the best time to do it because there's so much going on in those contract renewals that this becomes buried as an ask, as an ask, as an ask. I always tell people that this may be something that you want to try and get in. If you're in a current contract, a year or so before, if you're changing what you're doing with contractors in your previous contract, you want to try and get it in maybe into a current contract that expires a year and a half from now, so that upon renewal, you can decrease your counts by saying to Microsoft, okay, we're going to carry that contractor language forward, right? So, there's a few different things there. And I talked about some of these, these are sort of what we'll say are the best practices, is create profiles to eliminate enterprise products from their licensing stack, so to speak. Where it's possible, if you can get away with it, do not provide them hardware, because that's obviously a real, if you're providing them hardware, Microsoft's going to basically really kind of focus in on that, and it'd probably be hard to negotiate there. One of the things that I do say is, from an auditing perspective, if possible, put your contractors in an AD group so that they're easy to identify. If you have exceptions around when and how and who you need to license. And then the last thing that I would say is, put language in your contracts with the contractors themselves, so that if you are audited, you can kind of point back. And this is where we've been successful in beating this back in audits, is because customer had right in the contract that we're not responsible for providing hardware or software. And I always say, if you can put in there, for example, Microsoft Office, that goes a long way. Okay, and so I know that's a lot to kind of throw at us in a short period of time. I do see that there are a few questions. I'll put up the slide with my contact information if you want to get a hold of me. But Sean, maybe, because I haven't been able to keep up with them as they're kind of scrolling by here on the chat. But if you want to maybe throw some of those questions at me, I'll answer them. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'll try and answer them here with the few minutes that we have left.
Yeah. Perfect. Great, Mike. We do have a few questions piling up. If anyone else has questions, please enter them via the chat console. We'll do our best to get to them. So the first question we have, Mike, is what about an EA that had an FTE equivalent clause?
So an FTE equivalent clause, for those that don't have those, it's kind of like, instead of counting your qualified employees, there's almost like a formula to calculate what determines how you count FTEs. And if you have an FTE clause, again, that would be something that it would likely be something that Microsoft would look at and say your contractors probably need to be included in it. That's sort of why we're giving you this FTE equivalence clause. But it is something that potentially you could look at trying to negotiate language that excludes those FTEs, which is sometimes easier said than done, right? So It really is going to depend on what that language says specifically. But you know, from the ones that I have seen, usually contractors become included because Microsoft's giving you a formula to figure out what your qualified employees are. But again, it's not that you couldn't exclude them. It's, you know, you got to look at that FTE language to see if they need to be included, and then, you know, also do the track back through, you know, what are they doing, how are they accessing, are they on qualified devices, are they using, you know, these CALs and things like that. So, you know, I know that's probably a little vague in the answer, but that's kind of the way that it would work, at least from a high level perspective.
Okay, and the next question is, outside of the OS, should we be trying to get concurrent use licensing and then try to force Microsoft into that mode?
Oh, I would love to get concurrent use licensing. I think a lot of people would love to get concurrent use licensing. I mean, I think that, you know, should you be trying to get it? Absolutely. I mean, it's just one of those things where, especially global organizations or people using offshore, you know, or follow the sun type processes, concurrent use licensing would be, you know, really, you know, to your benefit, I guess, depending on the pricing that they give you. Microsoft hasn't done concurrency in probably, about 15 or 16 years now. You know, so could you negotiate it? Again, it's something that I would love, you know, for you to get, because I think it's, you know, to your advantage. I think it's something that you should be pushing them on, particularly with Office 365 and some of the ways that you know, that product works. But I don't know how likely it is. I mean, these are the sorts of things that Microsoft just does not want to set precedents in and decrease the number of you know, licenses that they're getting from clients. But you know, absolutely, concurrent licensing would be great, because you know, at that point in time, maybe you don't even care if your contractors are counted or not, because you're just going to look at the maximum number of users and license that's on the systems at any one time and license to that. But that would definitely be difficult. So.
Okay, so next question is, and this is more of a clarification, is for a contractor to be exempt, they have to meet 3 criteria: to not be on site, and non-managed, and non-qualified.
So what I would say is, the short answer is yes. I mean, that's going to be the case in 90% of the time, right? But you know, I can give you an example of on-site where they may not be, where they may not meet that qualified definition. So, you know, it's a great rule of thumb, but it's kind of what I'll call a rule of thumb. You've really got to kind of dig in and look at, what's going on. But here's an example where they're on-site. So you don't provide them hardware, and you don't allow them to be managed. So you set up a guest network, and all they come in is they hit the guest network, and they've sort of got internet connectivity, but they're not authenticating to your domain. They're not accessing your systems. They're not on your main network. They're on a guest network. You could exclude those people because you don't own the device, so it's not qualified, and it's not managed. So there's an example, and this is why it's important to look at all of these. Even though the rule of thumb would be they got to meet all 3 of those, there's an example of where an on-site contractor is legitimately not a qualified employee and exempt. Okay.
Okay, Mike, I actually have a question for you. So I was thinking as we were going through this. So in the case of an organization that's, you know, say a larger organization, they've got offshore contractors. If they were to actually receive a software asset management engagement or an audit, how likely would it be that that auditor would track back down those offshore contractors?
So I'm just going to launch one more survey, and then I'll answer your question, Sean. Just you know, we're going to put up an option for people to kind of pick what we do on our next webinar. So if you want to vote, if there any of those topics are of interest to you, just let us know. But the short answer to your contract is it's becoming more and more likely that they would find those offshore contractors. That's really going to depend on a couple of things. It's going to depend on how you're giving them access to your system. So, you know, if they're within your Active Directory, for instance, they're definitely going to, you know, find those contractors and look to, you know, have you license them. You know, that's probably a given. But it could be, looking at access to your servers and things like that, because one of the things they are getting is more sophisticated at looking at systems that are coming in from the outside, what I call traditional systems that are out in the DMZ and things like that, to determine what needs to be licensed and what doesn't need to be licensed. So it is probably pretty likely that they will find those. We are seeing that in our audits, that they are finding, offshore contractors or offsite contractors, and people are having to work through defending why they weren't licensing them if they weren't.
Okay, and I have one more. Mike, this is me kind of remembering back in my days at Microsoft, and one of the things we at Microsoft struggled with was when organizations had, an integrator like Accenture kind of embedded. We kind of pretended they weren't part of the conversation. Has that changed at all, or are they now part of the conversation very much so?
No, it hasn't changed. I mean, Microsoft's position on outsourcing, which I guess is a form of contractor, is that the outsourcer doesn't exist. And I guess to their defense, the contract is between you and your outsourcer. It's not a three-party contract between Microsoft, you, and the contractor or the outsourcer. So they do tend to, consider those people to be your employees, that the contractor, the outsourcer doesn't exist. That they look at those as contractors, and particularly on-site contractors. And this is one of the ones that's very tough for a lot of organizations to swallow, because if that contractor is doing work for their own company, so to speak, their company needs to have an office license for them, and then they come into your building and do work for you, and they have to have an office license from you. And so Microsoft's kind of getting 2 office licenses in those scenarios. So those are the ones that you really have to think through in how you're going to negotiate that with Microsoft, and how you're going to handle that with the contractor themselves, right? In terms of what you're, if you're already in an outsourcing contract, I guess there's not much you can do. But if you're looking at signing an outsourcing contract, you want to really look at who's responsible for software, who's responsible for paying for it, whose contract does it need to go in, and kind of work through that. One of the things that I didn't bring up, but it is in the product terms, is one of the ways Microsoft looks at this is who is the software, who's getting the business benefit out of the software. I can't remember the exact language that they use in there, but that's how they look at these things, even with contractors, is who's getting the business benefit out of the software. Is it you as an organization, or is it the contractor? And so if you can prove that the contractor is getting the business benefit out of using Microsoft, that goes a long way. But that's hard. That's kind of hard to do. Like if you've got a contractor that comes in, I don't know, let's use a real simple example. I got a marketing contractor that we want to come in to create some marketing pieces for us. They come in, they use Office and make some PowerPoint decks for us and things like that. Who's getting the business benefit out of that? Is it you because they created a PowerPoint deck that you're using in marketing, or is it them because you're paying them to make those? Microsoft will look at that and say that it's you because you're getting use of the work product. So they do kind of look at benefits, sort of similar to how they look at access. They will look at who gets the business benefit out of it. So if you can prove that you're not getting business benefit out of them using Microsoft products, they are, that goes a long way.
Okay, great, Mike. I think that pretty much wraps up the questions that we have. So I guess, do you have any closing remarks before we break for today?
No, I don't believe so. I think we saw some people want to have a kind of quick conversation about this. We'll follow up with those people individually. It looks like people want to see best negotiation tactics on when negotiating with Microsoft for our next webinar, followed closely by cloud. So maybe we'll kind of combine the 2 of those, because they are going hand in hand nowadays, and do that for our next topic. But if any other questions, please, my contact details are on the screen, or if you've got had a conversation with one of our sales reps, please feel free to reach out, and we're happy to answer questions when and where we can. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much, everyone.